He had expected the usual court proceedings, not this. He wasn't prepared to face the woman he had arrested, especially not in this setting. He glanced around the room, hoping for some sort of rescue, but the eyes of everyone present were locked on him. The judge, a stern man with decades of experience, looked at him expectantly. The other lawyers, the clerks, even the bailiffs, seemed to be waiting for his next move. Rachel, however, remained calm. She sat there, poised and confident, her gaze never leaving the officer. Her expression betrayed nothing, no anger, no frustration, just a quiet intensity. It was almost as if she was daring him to make the next move, forcing him to face the consequences of his actions. But the officer had no clue what those consequences might be. Was she going to make an example out of him? Would she press charges for false arrest or even misconduct? Or was this some kind of power play, a way for her to remind everyone who was truly in charge? The possibilities raced through his mind, but none of them offered any comfort. Rachel wasn't the only one in the room who seemed to have an agenda. The defense attorney, who had been sitting quietly until now, leaned forward, his eyes flicking between the officer and Rachel. He seemed to be calculating something, weighing the situation in his mind. The officer caught the faintest smirk on the lawyer's face, a look that told him he was aware of the underlying tension. It was clear that whatever happened next, this wouldn't be a simple court case. It was personal now. The officer knew the stakes were high. His reputation was on the line, and depending on how Rachel handled things, his career might be too. But there was more at play here than just one bad arrest. The system itself was under a microscope, and the growing tension in the rooms seemed to reflect something deeper, a mistrust between law enforcement and the legal system, a divide that could no longer be ignored. Rachel, as always, was a symbol of the law's power. But the officer's mind wandered to a deeper question. Had he been just another pawn in a system that sometimes worked against the very people it was supposed to protect? Had he been too quick to make assumptions, too eager to enforce the rules without questioning who was truly in control? The silence in the room was suffocating as the officer's fate hung in the balance. Would Rachel's response to his mistake lead to a greater confrontation between them, or would it expose even bigger flaws in the system they both served? And how much was she willing to risk to make sure the truth came out? As the gavel tapped once again, Rachel's next words would reveal more than anyone could anticipate. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, thickening with every second that passed. The officer's mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. He was no longer in control of the situation. He had always believed that the law was black and white, a clear-cut set of rules to follow. But now, standing before the chief prosecutor, everything felt blurred. The sharp eyes of Rachel Martinez were like lasers, cutting through any remaining sense of certainty he had left. The judge, sensing the rising tension, slammed his gavel on the desk. Order in the court. He barked, his voice echoing off the walls. It did little to break the suffocating silence. The officer shifted uneasily on his feet, his uniform suddenly feeling too tight. He knew this moment would define his career. The world seemed to slow down as he waited for Rachel to speak, to give her next move, but she simply watched him, her expression unreadable. Then finally, her voice broke the silence again, but it wasn't what he expected. "Officer Hayes," she said, her tone smooth, but laced with something that made his stomach tighten. "You made an arrest. You acted on a warrant you thought was valid. But here's the thing." She paused, allowing the words to hang in the air, hanging like a weight over him. "The warrant was never issued. It was a clerical error, a mistake that shouldn't have happened in the first place." The officer's heart skipped a beat. A clerical error. He couldn't believe it. If that was true, then what had he done? Was he really guilty of arresting her on a mistake that had been made behind the scenes? And if Rachel Martinez, of all people, was caught in such a mess, what would this mean for the system as a whole? He opened his mouth to speak, to apologize or defend himself, but no words came out. Rachel was not finished. She stood up now, her gaze never leaving his, and turned toward the judge. The room was hanging on every word she was about to say. Your Honor. The weight of it all sank in. His father's influence wasn't enough. Something was shifting behind the scenes, something far bigger than he could control. As the judge turned her attention back to the room, Brandon realized his entire world was teetering on the edge. This was no longer just about his mistake. It was about something far more dangerous, something that could unravel everything he had ever known. The suspense in the room thickened. Everyone, from the reporters to the lawyers, was on edge. The plot was about to thicken in a way no one had expected, and as Brandon tried to process what was happening, one thing was certain: the stakes had just gotten much higher. The room fell into a stunned silence as Gregory Blackwell leaned in, speaking quietly to the judge. His words were soft, but the impact was immediate. Brandon could feel his heart pounding in his chest as the judge listened intently, nodding every so often. His father's associate had just thrown a wrench into everything, and for a moment, it felt like the ground beneath Brandon's feet was shifting. Mr. Brandon, the judge finally said, breaking the silence. You've had your chance. You've disregarded the law and shown no respect for this courtroom. But now, there's new evidence. Evidence that, I believe, you and your family need to address. Brandon's stomach dropped. What was this new evidence? Was this the end of it all? His mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle, but before he could form any coherent thoughts, the judge motioned for Blackwell to present the evidence. Gregory stood, a cold smile on his face. He pulled out a set of documents, laying them across the table with deliberate precision. The room shifted again, tension thickening the air. Brandon couldn't help but feel that something was slipping out of his control, something he hadn't seen coming. These documents, Blackwell began, prove that Mr. Brandon's actions were not as reckless as they seemed. In fact, we have reason to believe this entire case has been misrepresented. He turned to face the judge, his voice gaining strength. These new findings suggest a larger conspiracy involving external parties that have been exploiting Mr. Brandon's name for their own gain. The judge raised an eyebrow. What exactly are you implying, Mr. Blackwell? Blackwell's eyes glinted with calculated confidence. I'm implying that Brandon was set up. His involvement in this situation wasn't entirely his fault. This isn't just a case of youthful arrogance. This is a case of manipulation. The courtroom erupted in whispers. The reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, trying to catch every word. Brandon's lawyer looked almost relieved, but still uncertain of where this was going. The judge studied the documents, her face unreadable. She didn't speak for a long moment, as if weighing the consequences of this new information. Brandon's head was spinning. This was the last thing he had expected. Could it be true? Had someone really been pulling the strings behind the scenes to set him up? As the judge looked back at Brandon, her expression softened ever so slightly. Mr. Brandon, it seems we have much more to consider than initially believed. However, your actions still stand. Recklessness and arrogance, no matter who influenced them, will not go unpunished. Brandon's heart skipped a beat. He had hoped for a way out, a clean break from the mess he had created. But it wasn't going to happen. Still, a part of him held onto a glimmer of hope. Maybe he could find a way to minimize the damage. Then came the judge's final words, and they hit him harder than anything else in that courtroom. You will be placed under house arrest for the next 6 months. Your privileges will be revoked, and you will be required to complete community service. Your family will be held accountable for the conspiracy, but your actions, will not go without consequences. Meanwhile, Brandon's frustration was turning to desperation. He couldn't let this happen. He'd spent his life getting whatever he wanted with a smile and a few words, but the world was showing him that there were limits. He couldn't shake the thought that everything was slipping through his fingers. Was this really how it ended for him? A life of luxury and ease, and now, this. Then, just as his frustration reached its peak, the sound of a door opening snapped him from his thoughts. A guard stepped inside, and Brandon looked up, hoping for good news. But when the man spoke, his words only intensified the feeling of dread hanging in the air. "Your bail hearing is in 1 hour," the guard said, his voice flat. "Get ready." Brandon swallowed hard. 1 hour. That was it? His chance to fix everything, to get back to the life he knew, and yet the pressure felt almost unbearable. He didn't know if he could make it through another hour of this. His palms were sweating, his heart racing. Was this where everything came crashing down? The next few moments felt like a blur. His lawyer finally arrived, but there was no comforting reassurance in his eyes. The lawyer was pale, his suit wrinkled, clearly out of his depth. "Brandon, we need to prepare. This isn't going to be easy." Brandon's blood ran cold. What did that mean? The clock was ticking. The walls seemed to close in tighter. What would happen in that hearing? Would his father's connections be enough? Or was this judge truly set on making an example of him? The unknown hung in the air, thick with tension. The final showdown was approaching, and no one knew how it would end. As Brandon sat anxiously, his mind racing, the minutes felt like hours. His lawyer, visibly stressed, kept glancing at his phone, muttering to himself. Something was off. The usual calm composure he had during high-stakes situations was gone. Brandon couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in even tighter. His father's lawyer was on his way, but Brandon had a sinking feeling that nothing could prepare them for what was coming. Suddenly, the door to the holding area opened again, and the guards stepped in. But this time, there was something different in the air. The man's expression was hard to read, but the brief pause before he spoke sent a chill through Brandon's spine. "Mr. Brandon," the guard said, his voice low, almost sympathetic. "You need to come with me. The judge has ordered a change in your hearing. It's been moved up." Brandon's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean moved up?" he asked, his voice trembling despite his best effort to stay calm. "You'll see soon enough," the guard replied, stepping aside to make way for Brandon. Confusion and panic flooded his mind as he followed the guard down the narrow hallway. What did this sudden change mean? Was this some sort of trick? Or worse, had the judge already made up her mind about him? His breath came faster, his palms clammy. He had never felt so uncertain. When they reached the courtroom doors, the scene inside was unlike anything Brandon expected. There were more people than before, press members, reporters with cameras, and even a few familiar faces from the upper echelons of his father's social circle. The energy in the room felt different. Almost, "You will be remanded into custody until further notice, Mr. Brandon, no exceptions." The room erupted in hushed chaos. Brandon stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. Wait, you can't do this. I have business meetings. I have." The judge interrupted, her voice sharp and final. "You will stay here until your bail hearing, Mr. Brandon. Your actions in my courtroom today have proven you're not above the law. Let's see if your wealth can buy you your freedom this time." The cold realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He couldn't believe it. This wasn't a petty fine, some meaningless slap on the wrist. This was real. The judge wasn't playing by the usual rules, and it left him utterly helpless. Brandon had spent his entire life believing that money and power could smooth over any problem, that he could charm or bully his way out of anything. But this judge, she wasn't impressed. Brandon's eyes darted around the courtroom, looking for anyone who could help him. His lawyer had his head in his hands, muttering something under his breath. Brandon's mind raced. How could this be happening? How had he gone from being the untouchable rich kid to this? As the bailiffs approached to escort him out of the courtroom, Brandon's heart pounded. His thoughts were jumbled, his confidence shattered. For the first time in his life, he truly felt powerless. Was this the moment his life would completely unravel? Outside the courtroom, a pair of his father's business associates watched the scene unfold from a distance. One of them, a sharply dressed man with an air of confidence about him, exchanged a quick glance with the other. They had always known Brandon was reckless, but they also knew how far his family's influence could reach. The idea of the young man actually facing consequences like this was unthinkable. But the question lingered, Could his father's power do anything to fix this now? Back inside the courtroom, as Brandon was led away, the judge looked down at the file once more. Her eyes softened for just a moment, but her resolve remained firm. She knew the young man in her custody wasn't the first to believe they were above the law, but she was determined to make sure he wouldn't be the last. Meanwhile, Brandon's mind swirled with panic. He couldn't stay in here. Not like this. He had to figure something out fast. But as the doors of the courtroom slammed shut behind him, it became clear that this